The spirit of the revealed religion has not yet surmounted its consciousness as such, or what is the same, its actual self-consciousness is not the object of its consciousness. Spirit itself as a whole and the self-differentiated moments within it fall within the sphere of picture thinking and in the form of objectivity. The content of this picture thinking is absolute spirit. And all that now remains to be done is to supersede this mere form, or rather, since this belongs to consciousness as such, its truth must already have yielded itself in the shape of consciousness. This surmounting of the object of consciousness is not to be taken one-sidedly to mean that the object showed itself as returning into the self, but is to be taken more specifically to mean not only that the object as such presented itself to the self as vanishing, but rather that it is the externalization of self-consciousness that posits the thinghood of the object, and that this externalization has not merely a negative, but a positive meaning, a meaning which is not only for us or in itself, but for self-consciousness itself. The negative of the object, or its self-supersession, has a positive meaning for self-consciousness. That is, self-consciousness knows the nothingness of the object. On the one hand, because it externalizes its own self, for in this externalization, it posits itself as object, or the object as itself, in virtue of the indivisible unity of being for self. On the other hand, this positing at the same time contains the other moment. That is, that self-consciousness has equally superseded this externalization and objectivity too, and taken it back into itself so that it is in communion with itself in its otherness as such. This is the movement of consciousness, and in that movement, consciousness is the totality of its moments. Equally, consciousness must have related itself to the object in accordance with the totality of the latter's determinations and have thus grasped it from the standpoint of each of them. This totality of its determinations establishes the object as an implicitly spiritual being, and it does truly become a spiritual being for consciousness when each of its individual determinations is grasped as a determination of the self, or through the spiritual relationship to them that was just mentioned. With paragraph 788, we now finally make our way into the final section of the Phenomenology of Spirit, called Absolute Knowing. And the absolute will get discussed an awful lot in this. And you might say, well, why does this culminate in knowing or knowledge? And why all this talk so much about consciousness and self-consciousness? Well, for Hegel, philosophy is indeed tied up with the practical, tied up with the world. We're going to see this already, a reference to, not the Wirklichkeit as such, but the Wirklich, actual self-consciousness that exists in this world in a temporal sense. But what we really are aiming at is something speculative, something theoretical in the sense of activity that contemplates, that understands, that makes sense of things. A resting place, if you like. And this is, kind of in touch with an older attitude towards the relationship between the speculative and the practical. We see so many ancient and medieval thinkers, prioritizing the higher level of philosophy, not just concerned with human affairs, but also understanding this in terms of resting in its object at last, no longer being caught up in a restless process. And this can be quite active. Aristotle's reference, which Hegel picked up way earlier in the Phenomenology, to thought, thinking itself. It's not a completely inactive thing, but it's active in a different way. And that's sort of where we're moving to. It's interesting to note, too, if you compare this to the beginning of the religion section, or the beginning of some of the other sections, reason, spirit, we wind up at some sort of endpoint within the previous very complicated dialectic that has developed. So, consciousness and self-consciousness feed into reason. Reason's long discursus and digressions and dialectics lead into spirit. And then spirit is by far even a longer section. A lot happens in there. Eventually we get to the Enlightenment, freedom and the terror, all this stuff about morality, conscience, and the beautiful soul, of course. And then it feeds into religion, and we begin with, you could say, a new problematic, but not one that's absolutely out of the blue, one that is in part referencing what happened earlier. And we're going to see two different things going on in this paragraph that are kind of similar to what's going on in the first paragraphs of religion. So we have a reference to the previous stage, the previous shape of consciousness, in this case, revealed religion, the culmination of the large religion section, where we began with natural religion and then religion in the form of art and then revealed religion, right? So there's a singular focus, you might say a cumulative focus. And then, as we're going to see a little bit later on, there's this whole reference back, well, actually first to a kind of generic sense of this, to gestalten forms of consciousness. And then at the end of this, he's going to say that we've got a movement of consciousness, which we're going to talk about in a bit. In that movement, consciousness is the totality of its moments. And so it relates itself to the object in accordance with the totality of the object's determinations, and it grasps them, or grasps it, the object, from the standpoint of each of them. Well, what does that mean? Well, Hegelian philosophy is devoted to looking at things that are complex in their complexity, in their totality, as he's calling it here. And so with each of those shapes of consciousness, as we're going to see in the next couple paragraphs, some very explicit references to particular shapes of consciousness, he's going to say that we've got a totality of determinations establishing the object as an implicitly spiritual being, and that each of the individual determinations is grasped as a determination of the self. And what is that? Well, that's all the previous shapes of consciousness that we have worked our way through. They're still out there in the world, so to speak. This brings up a very important question that we can raise for Hegel and Hegelianism. Well, we just move like from stage to stage, progress happens, and then we leave behind pretty much all of the stuff except what is aufgehoben, what is sublated or transcended while incorporating in terms of its idea or what matters to it. Well, that's one interpretation, right? And you get this linear history, first this, then this, then this, then this, and we move in a nice progression that you can chart out. But the world is way more complicated than that. The previous shapes of consciousness still occur, right? That's part of why the phenomenology, despite the fact of Hegel being wrong that history ended, a whole other topic to talk about, can prove useful for people in the present. We can be like, we see something happening, and then we're like, well, this looks an awful lot like, I'm just grabbing something at random here, paragraph 482, where it talks about the Lord of the world becoming conscious of what they are, the universal power of the actual world, the destructive power they exercise against the self of their subjects, the self which stands against them. His power is not the union and harmony of spirit in which persons would recognize their own self-consciousness. And we can look at that and we can say, holy crap, that's happening right here. This is happening politically. This is happening in terms of the CEO of this multinational corporation. This is happening in this educational institution. This is happening, and we could go down the line. couldn't we? So it's not as if everything is completely superseded and gone away. And that is kind of like what happened in the religion section when we saw that Hegel said, hey, these four previous developments, the consciousness section, the self-consciousness section, and you're like, well, how the hell does this follow from what happened in Force and the Understanding? The reason section and the spirit section are all brought together into the knot that is religion. And while we're doing that now with absolute knowing. So that's a little bit of a discursus and commentary before we begin. Let's actually jump into the paragraph. He talks about the spirit of the revealed religion, the Geist, right, of the revealed religion has not yet surmounted its consciousness as such. And it's interesting because there's two different words that are getting used in here, two different terms for a process of transcending, right? There is surmounting, and that translates überwinden or Überwindung, right? The verb or the sort of noun corresponding to that process. That's not the same thing as supersession, aufheben, right? But there's, in both cases, a transcending that is going on. So he says that the spirit of revealed religion has not yet surmounted its consciousness as such, or what is the same, and here's what we have written up here, its actual self-consciousness. The self-consciousness that it is, the person that it is not the object of its consciousness. Something else is the object, the Gegenstand of its consciousness, and so it's kind of missing itself. It may be misrepresenting itself. It may be repressing what it is. It may be abstracting away or substituting some narrative, as people do in revealed religion, thinking, I am like one of the apostles. No, you're existing in the 21st century. You're not an apostle. That was back then, right? Take stock of who you are today in the present, or in Hegel's present, of course, the beginning of the 19th century. So, he goes on and he says, spirit itself as a whole and the self-differentiated moments within it fall, now he's talking about revealed religion once again, within the sphere of picture thinking, and we've talked a lot about this, picture thinking, Vorstellung, Vorstellen, and it could be representation. It could even be translated as imagination, right? We saw that back in the religion section. So we saw that we don't want to completely get rid of picture thinking, narratives, stories, ideas, but we don't want to remain entirely dependent on it. We want to move towards conceptual or notional thought, right? Begriffen and begriffliche thought. So what we've got here is, on the one side, picture thinking, and then he talks about the form of objectivity, Gegenständlichkeit, right? The being in the form of an object. And so this is what picture thinking is doing, and he says the content of this picture thinking is absolute spirit, the Inhalt, what it is that it's got there. But we're not yet at the point where the form corresponds to the content, and we want to put it in the form of something greater than that, something that is going to do justice to absolute spirit. So he says all that now remains to be done is to supersede, aufheben, right, this mere form, or rather, now this is kind of an interesting phrase, rather, since this belongs to consciousness as such, what belongs to consciousness as such, its truth must have already yielded itself in the shape of consciousness. Truth, Wahrheit. This is what we've been searching for this entire time, what we've been grasping partially, seeing that something is true, but not completely true, and we're trying to get to a place where it's more true. And the truth is going to be there in a shape, Gestalt of consciousness. So the previous things that we've been looking at, very important, right? And we want to move to a new shape of consciousness now, and that shape of consciousness is called absolute knowing, right? And it's not just going to be, by the way, I should signal this ahead of time, It's not just going to be me as the philosopher or you as the philosopher or, us sort of like, Hegel, we're not worthy of you, worshiping at the idol of Hegel. It's supposed to be a community. I mean, that was part of what we achieved in the previous stage, realizing that the individual has its meaning, its thought, its activity within the scope of a community of others who are related to it in terms of something that has been a desire since the beginning of the self-consciousness section, recognition or acknowledgement, right? All right, back to the text. So he says, truth must already have yielded itself in the shape of consciousness. This surmounting of the object of consciousness, the Gegenstand, is not to be taken one-sidedly. Whenever Hegel brings up one-sidedness, that's not good from his perspective. It means that there's something true and something false involved there, right? So he goes on and he says, we don't want to take this one-sidedly to mean that the object showed itself as returning to the self, but it's to be taken more specifically to mean not only that the object has presented itself to the self as vanishing, verschwinden, right? What does it mean, vanishing? Does that mean like literally it shows up and sort of like playing whack-a-mole, you're like, there it is, and then boop, it goes back down in its hole, and you're like, where'd it go? And then it pops up again over here. No, it means that what you're getting is, we might say phenomenologically, only part of the object. There's other parts that are not being given to us. And as we turn our attention from one side to the other, as we get to what we're talking about later on, right, the totality of individual determinations, we're not able to take it all in. And this is, normal perception, right? Also with objects of thought or other kinds of things that we could talk about. So he goes on and he says, it's rather that it is the externalization of self-consciousness. Right? So we have the self, and the self here is self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein. It engages in externalization, a word that we've seen used a lot in the previous section before crossing the threshold into absolute knowing, and Äußerung. It's interesting because Pinker translates this as self-emptying. Usually Pinker, I've found, is a little bit better than Miller, the text that we've been using this entire time, but I think externalization is actually closer to the raw meaning of this. It goes outside of itself. You could call it self-emptying if you mean that the self that's here, when it locates other parts of itself outside of itself, it does become empty in those, right? It becomes vulnerable is another way of thinking about it. In its actuality, in its activity, it's becoming actual. So it externalizes itself, right? And in doing so, what is it doing? So he says that it posits, literally just sets, puts down the thinghood, the Dingheit. Notice a difference in terminology here. So Thingheit, Dingheit, thinghood, is not exactly the same thing as objectivity or objectness, Gegenständlichkeit, right? Or ein Gegenstand sein, right? Being an object. Thing and object are not precisely the same, but there's a lot of overlap there, right? So there's kind of a nice complementarity going on here. Posits the thinghood, and here Miller brackets of the object, and because that's not there directly in the German, the thinghood of dasselbe, right? Which could be the object. Makes sense to say that, right? So the self-consciousness externalizes itself, posits the object. The object is showing itself to the self-consciousness, but the self-consciousness is always also doing something with the object in relation to the object. And so then he goes on and he says that this externalization has two meanings. At least two meanings here, right? Not merely a negative, but also a positive meaning, a Bedeutung, reference, you could also say if you want to. A meaning which is, and now we could say, here's some differentiation, not merely for us or in itself. We could say, well, that's the negative meaning that we're getting here. And notice that he doesn't say for itself right away, for us. You might say, well, why is he differentiating us apart from the self-consciousness when that self-consciousness, this is where we're supposed to be, isn't it? Isn't this where we are and where Hegel is himself? This is the culmination of the whole phenomenological project that is the Phenomenology of Spirit. Well, there's still a non-coincidence between self-consciousness, even actual self-consciousness as such, and our self-consciousness, right? And then we've also got the in itself, right? That would be negative. And what would be the positive? Well, the for itself, für es selbst, right? Which is a kind of interesting way of expressing the for itself right there. So we go on, and, so we've got a negative and positive meaning. The negative of the object, he says, or its self-supersession. So now here again we get that aufheben, right? That's so important to the Hegelian dialectic. But it's not just something being sublated. It is something sublating its very own self. Self-supersession doesn't quite capture the sich selbst aufheben, its very own self, right? So that's the negative. And this passes over into something positive, a positive attitude towards not negativity as such anymore, but nothingness or being nothing. So he goes on and he says, self-consciousness knows the nothingness of the object, right? Weiß is knowing there, wissen, so, makes sense with the absolute knowing. Knows the Nichtigkeit of the object. And again, here, dasselbe, of that thing. So it knows, now when it's saying it knows the nothingness of the object, is it saying it knows the object as nothing? No, but there is a nothingness within the object, a negativity, as there is in everything. Right? So he goes on and he says, knows the nothingness of the object on the one hand, because it externalizes its own self. So in externalizing itself, it knows this nothingness of the object. Why? Because in this externalization, it posits no longer just the object, itself as object, or the object as itself, in virtue of the indivisible unity of being for self. Being for self is often framed as, kind of in some way being lesser than being in itself or being for others or stuff like that. In this case, we're getting something really important here. The for itself is encompassing the in itself, the for us, for others, right? And so self-consciousness posits itself as an object that also has nothingness within it, same as the other objects that it's engaged in. Then he says, on the other hand, this positing at the same time contains the other moment. So we've got a duplication here as well. And what is that? That self-consciousness has equally superseded, aufgeheben, right? Now again, superseded what? The externalization and objectivity too. So its own externalization culminates in the supersession of its own externalization, right? Externalization isn't as simple as it first seemed, and it's also superseding this objectivity, Gegenständlichkeit. Doesn't mean that the objects go away. Doesn't mean that the self isn't an object for itself, but it's grasping it more. Once again, can this be done through picture thinking? it can't be done through picture thinking. It can be pictured through picture thinking, represented, but that representation always falls short of the activity of thinking and working your way to this. What is being given to us here? This is not Vorstellung. This is thought. This is concept. Concepts, you might say, in the plural. So he goes on and he says, self-consciousness has equally superseded this and taken it back into itself. Now, this communion with itself, that's a sort of additional word that Hegel doesn't say. It's just with itself, right? But Miller put that in there. But it is with itself in its otherness as such. It is other to itself. It is also how it is itself. And he goes on to say, this is the movement of consciousness. And in that movement, consciousness is the totality of its moments. A very important word here. We're getting to the point of wanting to grasp the totality. So all of this stuff is what is, being generated as mental activity, you could say, and then coming back to self-consciousness in this movement. And here we get to the end of this paragraph, right? So he says, equally, consciousness must have related itself to the object in accordance with the totality of the latter's determinations, and thus grasped it from the standpoint of each of them. And that can be grasped in terms of a gestalt of consciousness. It can be grasped in terms of, the thing in its properties, which is one of the earlier stages, how it is in, force in the understanding in terms of being part of a larger matrix. It can be grasping yourself in terms of the self-consciousness section. Are you the unhappy consciousness? Are you retreating into what Hegel, mistakenly construes as Stoicism or skepticism? We could go on and on and on, right? And he's going to in the following paragraph. So he tells us, this totality of its determinations establishes the object, the Gegenstand, as an implicitly spiritual being. So a spiritual being that is spiritual, but has to have that implicitness drawn out of it, that An-Sichheit, we could say, or An-Sich-Sein, right? And it does truly, he says, become a spiritual being for consciousness when each of its individual determinations is grasped as a determination of the self that is conscious of them. And this could be being conscious of, objects. This could be being conscious of social processes. This could be being conscious of where I fit into all of this. All of those can be, Gegenständen for consciousness. And so he says they're grasped as a determination of the self, or through the spiritual relationship to them. That was just mentioned. What is the spiritual relationship to them? All of this stuff, right? So we're going to have this important externalization going on. We're moving now past revealed religion and the representation that it made possible for us. And now we're going to be able to look back in a new way on all the terrain which we as phenomenologists, following along with Hegel as a phenomenologist, thinking about the development of consciousness through history, and that means through individual consciousnesses relating to each other, through economic processes, through culture, through science, and we could go on and on and on, right? And also through conflict, because that's driving the dialectic. We are now able to look back at that and appreciate it as a whole, but also in each of the determinations of each of these previous stages. And then we can figure out what the hell we're doing here. And part of the answer to that is, we're looking at this stuff and thinking about where do we go following that.